Hey everybody, it's Pastor Dave here, and we are continuing our Ask the Pastor night, and I have a good amount of questions that were submitted, and so I promise that we are going to get to yours. Tonight we're going to spend a little bit more time in Genesis so that we can just dive into some of these questions that were asked, that were submitted. And I'm going to be using some resources along with the scriptures. One of those is part of the Hebrew Bible, the Hebrew Bible translation with commentary by Robert Alter, as well as, once again, Genesis for Normal People by Peter Enns and Jared Byas. And we won't be able to meet for SWAT for at least several more weeks, at least through Easter, because of everything going on with the coronavirus. So far, our bishop has recommended that we not meet at least until after Easter. And so we'll have a few more Sunday nights together where I seek to answer some questions for you. Pardon me. That I seek to answer some questions for you that you submitted. So I wanted to spend just a little bit more time on that question of what proof is there of creation. If you didn't watch last week's recording, you can do that. It's on Facebook on our Epworth SWAT page. This time I am posting to our YouTube page. But if you want to kind of catch up, if you didn't watch it last week, tune in there. So a question was submitted: what proof is there of creation? And what I want you to imagine with me as we start is an illustration that came from the Genesis for Normal People book. Imagine with me that your family your family decided that you're going to play a board game. And maybe you're doing that a lot lately with not being able to go anywhere. But maybe your family decided they wanted to play a board game, but you're going to play Monopoly, and you needed the table because you needed places to, put all the board and the pieces and the cards and the little houses and apartments. But when you went out to your kitchen table, it was covered with stuff. And that's where you were going to play. And it had, books on there and backpacks and old papers and junk mail and lists, and it was even a little sticky because someone got some maple syrup on it from breakfast that didn't fully get cleaned up. Well, if you wanted to sit there and play Monopoly, you would first have to order that table. You'd have to take off the papers, you'd have to clean the table, you'd have to put the backpack somewhere else. And once you did all that, then you could lay down the Monopoly board. You could lay down, the cash and the cards and the game pieces and the little houses and the apartments. You could do that then once you finally had cleaned the table and organized it. And that's really the description that we find the scriptures telling us of how God created. Last week we looked at that verse there right in the beginning where it says, in the beginning, when God began to create the heavens and the earth, a good interpretation of that is the earth was chaotic and the darkness covered the faces of the deep, while a word from God swept over the face of the waters. Hold on one second. Soren's thirsty. Hey, Aurora, will you help Soren get a drink? Yeah, get him a juice box, please. All right. Hey, everybody. Hey, I'm back. That's what happens when you have kids. So, all right. So, yes. All right. So it says, in the beginning, the earth was chaotic and darkness covered the face of the deep, while a wind from God swept over the face of the waters. And so something important for us to remember is that in the ancient world of biblical times, In their understanding, God did not create something out of nothing. That wasn't a concept that was familiar to them. Uh, and for them, it was more this idea that the world looks the way that it does because God created order out of chaos. Not that God created something out of nothing, but God took what there was and created order out of it. And so that's something that's very important for us to think about when we're thinking about this question of what proof is there of creation. And even that phrase, the earth was chaotic. The Hebrew phrase that is used here is two Hebrew words that are put together. It's tohu bohu. Tohu bohu. I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right. Hebrew experts out there, I'm sorry if I totally butchered that. But this a Hebrew phrase that has two words put together basically means a formless void. Or, and even more interesting is this phrase, tohu bohu, that has made its way into the English language. You know, tohu meaning formless, bohu meaning empty. In the English, we have interpreted that phrase to mean utterly chaos. So rather than God creating something out of nothing, it was more about God taking this utter chaos and darkness and creating calm and order and structure out of it. And so that gives us some direction when it comes to what proof is there of chaos. And when we look at this, hold on one second. Sorry, go play, buddy. And so when we look at Genesis chapter 1, it's important also to think about when this was written. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that Genesis chapter 1, this creation story, was probably written when Israel was held in Babylonian, not Egyptian, but when Israel was held in captivity by the Babylonians. And so this story of creation in Genesis 1 contrasts a lot of ways that the Babylonians viewed creation. They showed some differences, and really it's a pretty heavy topic. It's too much to cover right now. If you're interested in that, I can give you some resources for that. But the Israel understanding of creation that we see here in Genesis chapter 1 kind of contrasts the Babylonian understanding of how creation worked. And so Genesis 1 was not so much written to answer our curiosity about how the universe came to be, or it wasn't written to show us, how to understand the Big Bang or the expanding universe or Einstein's theory of relativity. That's not really why the story that we find of creation was written in Genesis chapter 1. Rather, when we read Genesis chapter 1 and this creation story, we need to see it more as focusing on the story of the Israelites and their God, and how the Israelites' God was not like the God of other nations. That their God was not a chaos creator, but a chaos tamer. And that God didn't have, that the Israelite God didn't have all these various gods working against him, but it was more about God alone created the universe. Sorry if you can hear my son in the background. He's having a little bit of fun. So Israel was showing that this is our story. This is what our God is like. And it's not like the gods that you know. And later in the Exodus story, you'll actually see that the Israelites are proclaiming that not only is God a creator, but God is also a deliverer. So when it comes to this story of creation and the question of what proof is there of creation, I want you to see it more that it's not about God creating the universe out of nothing, but it's more of God calming and ordering the chaos in the world. And it makes sense that the Israelites would communicate it in this way because this is the ancient view of the world during that time. And that was the time that they were in. So the big key for us and thinking about what proof is there of creation is to understand why this story was written in the first place. That the point of this ancient story is to tell a story, not to inform us on how the mechanics of the universe were made. So that's really what I would encourage you to think about when we think about this story of creation. Now, and I got this is pretty heavy stuff, so I have notes written down, so I make sure I stay on track with you all as well. So, now another question that was raised that goes right into that story of Genesis is someone submitted the question. Hold on one second. Hey, kids, please play quietly while I'm recording, okay? Please stop screaming, all right? I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Awesome. All right. So another question that was submitted was, did Adam and Eve's kids have incest? And so that kind of moves us from Genesis chapter 1 into Genesis chapter 2. But if you read Genesis chapter 1 and you read Genesis chapter 2, there's almost a little deja vu. Like, didn't we already learn about this? But we see in Genesis chapter 2, it talks about the account of the generations of heaven and earth and why they were created. But we already heard about this in Genesis chapter 1. And when you look at Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, they give very different descriptions of the creation story. Where Genesis chapter 1, we see in day 3, that's when vegetation was created. We see in Genesis chapter 1, in days 5 and 6, that's when the animals were created. And then almost like a grand finale on day 6 is when God creates the humans. But when you look at Genesis chapter 2, it says that man, not humans, not man and woman, but man was created before the vegetables and before the animals. And in Genesis chapter 2, we find Adam naming the animals. And after all those things are created, then it says that there was no suitable partner for Adam. And so then God created woman out of Adam. So there's some differences in the telling of the creation story in these first 2 chapters. So sometimes you'll hear people say, talk about the 2 creation stories because they seem like 2 very different descriptions of how creation came to be. And even when you read these 2 chapters, when you read Genesis chapter 1 and Genesis chapter 2, God almost has a different feel to how he interacted when it came to their creation. In Genesis chapter 1, God seems very high lofty, sovereign, who God moves over things and creates things simply by a verbal command. And so there is this God above and away from everything, creating everything. But then in Genesis chapter 2, God seems more interactive, almost human-like, where he is involved in the action on the ground. God isn't just creating from afar, but God is involved in the action on the ground. He forms people out of the dust. He molds them like clay, like a potter. Even when you look in Genesis chapter 3, we find God planting a garden and can be found taking a stroll in Genesis chapter 3, verse 8. So part of the issue, even looking at what proof is there of creation, is where are you starting? And then answering this question, did Adam and Eve's kids have incest? We run into issues with that when we look at these two chapters. And the problems come when we try to harmonize these two chapters together. And part of the problem with that is because Genesis 2 is not another version of the creation of the cosmos. And I know some people are like, whoa, 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 whoa. But if you look, you research, you look through theology, Genesis 2 is more focused on the story of Israel and those parallels between Adam and Eve and creation and the story of Israel. And unlike Genesis chapter 1, which was probably written during the Babylonian captivity, Genesis chapter 2 was actually probably written sooner than that. Genesis chapter 2 was actually probably written several centuries before Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 2 was probably written when Israel still had kings, centuries before the Babylonian exile. And so the story of Cain and Abel shows us that the story of Adam and Eve is not about the focus. The focus is not on the creation of humans. Now, the logical question then is, so what is Genesis 2, story Cain and Abel and all that? What is the focus of that story? Well, when we look in Genesis chapter 2, 3, those chapters there and beyond, we read in the scriptures that Cain kills Abel. And so at this point, if we look at Genesis chapter 2 as a actual facts of how many people there were, at that point, there should have only been Adam, Eve, Cain, Abel. But when Cain kills Abel, it says that God banishes Cain to be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth. And so because of that, it says Cain becomes afraid. Cain is paranoid. He's afraid that anyone who meets him will kill him. Talks about that in verse 14. Anyone that meets you will kill you, but there's 4 of you, and you killed one. So now there's Adam, Eve, and Cain. So who are these other people? And so the scripture says that God puts a mark on Cain's head to let everyone know not to harm Cain. Let everyone know who is this everyone. But then it says that Cain is satisfied and he goes to the land of Nod, which also means wandering, and it's east of Eden. Maybe some of you have actually read the book by John Steinbeck called East of Eden, kind of referencing this story. And it says that when Cain goes to Nod, that he finds a wife, he settles down, and he builds a city. So the question then comes up, Where did Cain find his wife? Where did his wife come from? Where did this group of people that Cain was afraid were going to hurt him come from? Now, some people decide to read Genesis chapter 2 through 4 as another creation story, then would go and point to Genesis chapter 5, verse 4, where it talks about Adam and Eve having other sons and daughters. But if we read that as saying, see, this is all connecting. If we read the story that way, we need to stop, because it doesn't say that Cain married one of his sisters and had children and built a city. When we read it that way, we are reading into the story. We are reading into the story that's not there. As the Genesis chapter 5, verse 4 seems to say that there were other people born after Seth, after Adam and Eve's replacement child for Abel. All of that happened after the banishment of Cain and his marriage. So when we think about that, everyone, if Cain found one of his sisters in the land of Nod and married her, and all these other people were other brothers and sisters of Cain, that means that this city that Cain built would have been filled with other brothers and sisters of Cain that had been banished from the Garden of Eden. But you notice the scripture doesn't say that. The scriptures don't say that Cain went to the land of Nod, found his other brothers and sisters, took one of his sisters as his wife, and because they had all been banished, they built a city together. The scriptures do not say that. So what is the simpler explanation? The simpler explanation is this: that when you look at Genesis chapter 2, it's a different story. It's not about creation like Genesis chapter 1 was. And where Genesis chapter 1 told it in a different way. It wasn't focused on the mechanics of things, but was telling a story. And then Genesis chapter 2 is more focused on the story of Israel. So a simpler explanation, when we look at this question of, did Cain have incest? Did they have incest with their brothers and sisters? I believe the answer is no. And how is that possible? Because I believe there were other people living outside of the Garden of Eden all along, even if the story doesn't explain it. Because when we read into the story as Cain went to Nod, married one of his sisters, and there was lots of his brothers and sisters of Adam and Eve living there, then you have to assume that all those other brothers and sisters had been banished from the Garden of Eden. And why? And there's way too much reading into the text. But when you look at the scriptures, it's more focused on Cain leaving and meeting these other people because he was afraid these other people would harm him. And not only in Nod, but these other people, just other people out there would hurt him, would harm him, because God was sending him out from Eden. And so this story of Adam and Eve isn't about the first human beings. What is it about then? The story, the Adam story, is a story of Israel. It's a story of Israel in miniature. It is using this story of Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel and these other people and the wandering. It's a preview of the story of Israel, their journey. The story of Adam is the story of Israel. And when we begin to look at it like that, it begins to make more sense to us of like, wait, Who are these people that Cain was afraid of? I thought there was only Adam, Eve, Cain, and Abel. And where did these other people come from? And who did Cain marry? And was that his sister? And did all these people marry their brothers and sisters? When you think about it, not as an explanation of where all these first human beings came from, but more as the Israelites explaining their history, connecting their history with a story, then these stories make sense. We're able to think about these stories and connect them with the Israelite story and how they viewed God. Just like Genesis chapter 1 is Israel saying, this is what our God is like. Our God is not like all these other gods out there. Our God is a loving creator, deliverer, who didn't create something out of nothing, but took the utter chaos of the world and created calm, order, structure out of it. And then Genesis 2, not being, this isn't, broken down into, this is exactly what this looked like, but this is the story of Israel, how it connects with the people. When we begin to look at the creation story like that, then it makes sense for us. Then we can begin to wrap our minds around, this is what Israel is doing. Genesis 1, trying to show this is who God is and what God is like. Genesis 2, this is our story connecting with that. Genesis 2, through 4 and on. And we see that, like I talked about last week, we see Genesis not as this individual book, but we see Genesis connected to the Pentateuch. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, those 5 books connected together, not separated, but Genesis connected to those other 4 books explaining who God is and their journey and at times successes and failures. All right, buddy, hey, go in there and play, okay? But their story of Genesis connected with Leviticus, Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, telling the story of how God, or who God is, what God is like, and how their story connects with God in their successes, in their failures, their forming of a nation, their bondage to other people and slavery, their freedom, their wandering, all of that begins to make sense then when we read the story of Genesis 1 and Genesis chapter 2. So guys, it's almost about a half hour now that I've been talking. That's a lot of talking. I totally understand. This is some heavy stuff. Like I said, we got more time to cover this stuff. Clearly, I did not fully explain all of the details. Like we go further in the Bible, we find a lineage that links Adam and keeps going down further and further. We can go into that more later. But the big thing is, we're going to tackle this little bit by little bit because you all have asked some really, really good questions. And at the same time, they're very deep, a little bit too deep to spend just 1 or 2 times going over them. So we're going to keep looking at these questions that you have submitted. I will try to answer these more. Thank you for hanging in there with me, listening to me kind of go over the stuff. Like I said, this is heavy stuff, and this is just the first 4 chapters of the Bible. And I am not an expert on all of this stuff. I do my best as a person who learns and grows in their faith to learn from others. In our Wesleyan tradition of looking at the scriptures, looking at tradition, looking at experience, looking at reason, and trying to understand all of those theological reflections when it comes to our faith and our God. So thank you for joining me tonight. Appreciate you all being here, and take care, and I will see you soon. God bless.